The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Charles adjusted his formal uniform for what would become one of the most talked-about moments in recent royal history. The occasion was the annual Commonwealth Day service, an event that typically proceeded with clockwork precision and carefully choreographed interactions. But this particular morning would prove to be anything but typical. Charles had woken earlier than usual, his mind heavy with thoughts that had been troubling him for weeks. The relationship between him and Camilla had grown increasingly strained, though the public remained largely unaware of the tensions brewing behind palace walls. Their conversations had become formal, almost businesslike, lacking the warmth that had once characterized their partnership. The spark that had sustained them through years of public scrutiny seemed to be dimming. As he prepared for the day ahead, Charles found himself thinking about Kate. The Duchess of Cambridge had always impressed him with her grace, intelligence, and genuine warmth. Unlike the calculated interactions he often experienced in royal circles, Kate's presence felt authentic and refreshing. She had a way of making even the most formal occasions feel natural and comfortable. The irony wasn't lost on him that Kate was married to his son William, making his growing appreciation for her company all the more complicated. He told himself it was simply admiration for her dedication to royal duties and her natural ability to connect with people. Yet deep down, he knew his feelings were more complex than mere professional respect. Camilla, meanwhile, had been dealing with her own set of challenges. The constant scrutiny of their relationship had taken its toll, and she found herself increasingly isolated within the royal circle. The public had never fully embraced her as they had Diana, and this reality weighed heavily on her daily interactions. She had hoped that time would heal the wounds and win over the skeptics, but progress seemed frustratingly slow. The tension between Charles and Camilla had become palpable to those closest to them. Palace staff noticed the subtle changes in their behavior, the way they no longer sought each other's company during informal moments, how their conversations lacked the easy intimacy they once shared. The couple who had fought so hard to be together now seemed to be drifting apart. As the royal family gathered for the Commonwealth service, the usual protocols were in place. Seating arrangements had been meticulously planned, with each member of the family assigned specific positions based on rank and tradition. Charles was to sit beside Camilla, with William and Kate positioned nearby. The arrangement seemed perfect on paper, but the underlying tensions would soon make themselves known. Kate arrived at the venue looking radiant in an elegant navy dress that perfectly complemented the formal nature of the occasion. Her natural poise and genuine smile immediately brightened the atmosphere. She had always possessed an innate ability to make others feel at ease, a quality that had served her well in her royal role. As she took her place, she exchanged polite greetings with other family members, her warmth evident in every interaction. The service began with the traditional pomp and ceremony that the public expected from such occasions. The organ music filled the magnificent cathedral, while members of the royal family maintained their composed expressions, well practiced in the art of public appearances. Yet beneath this veneer of formality, undercurrents of emotion were beginning to stir. Charles found himself stealing glances at Kate throughout the early portions of the service. Her attentiveness to the proceedings, the way she genuinely engaged with the spiritual aspects of the ceremony, and her natural grace captured his attention repeatedly. He tried to focus on his duties as the future king, but his eyes kept wandering in her direction. Camilla, seated beside him, began to notice Charles's distracted behavior. At first, she attributed it to the weight of royal responsibilities or perhaps fatigue from their increasingly busy schedule. However, as the service continued, she became aware of where his attention was directed. The realization hit her like a cold wind, sending a chill through her entire being. The moment that would later be dissected by royal watchers and media analysts around the world occurred during a particularly moving hymn. As the congregation rose to sing, there was a brief moment when the carefully orchestrated seating arrangement created an opportunity for interaction. Camilla, perhaps seeking to bridge the growing distance between them, reached out toward Charles with a gesture that spoke of hope and reconciliation. But Charles, seemingly oblivious to Camilla's outstretched hand, turned instead toward Kate. The movement appeared natural enough to casual observers, but those who knew the family dynamics recognized the significance immediately. His body language shifted away from his wife toward his daughter-in-law, creating a visual metaphor that would haunt Camilla for days to come. Kate, unaware of the complex emotions swirling around her, responded to Charles with her characteristic warmth and respect. Their brief interaction was perfectly appropriate and innocent, yet it carried an undeniable energy that seemed to illuminate both of their faces. For a moment, the formal constraints of royal protocol seemed to fade away, replaced by a genuine human connection. The silence that followed this moment was deafening in its implications. Camilla's hand remained suspended for several heartbeats before she slowly withdrew it, her face carefully maintaining its composed expression despite the emotional earthquake occurring within her. The rejection, though perhaps unintentional, felt devastating in its completeness. Palace staff who witnessed the exchange recognized immediately that something significant had occurred. Years of observing royal family dynamics had given them an acute sensitivity to the subtle signals and gestures that revealed the true state of relationships within the family. This moment would be remembered and discussed in hushed tones for months to come. The remainder of the service passed in a blur of complex emotions. Charles seemed energized by his interaction with Kate, his demeanor becoming more animated and engaged than it had been in weeks. Kate, though maintaining her professional composure, appeared touched by the special attention from her father-in-law. Their connection, innocent though it may have been, created a bubble of warmth that seemed to exclude everyone else around them. Camilla struggled to maintain her composure as the service continued. Every smile felt forced, every gesture carefully calculated to hide the turmoil within. She had faced public scrutiny and criticism throughout her relationship with Charles, but this felt different. This felt personal in a way that cut deeper than any media attack or public demonstration of disapproval. As the ceremony concluded and the royal family prepared to leave, the dynamics that had shifted during the service continued to play out. Charles remained attentive to Kate, ensuring she was comfortable and had everything she needed. His solicitude was touching and completely appropriate, yet it created an additional layer of pain for Camilla, who found herself increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by family and staff. The ride back to the palace was conducted mostly in silence, with each member of the family lost in their own thoughts about what had transpired. Charles seemed almost buoyant, energized by what he perceived as a meaningful connection with Kate. Kate herself was thoughtful, perhaps beginning to sense that her presence had somehow become a source of comfort and inspiration for Charles in ways that extended beyond normal family relationships. Camilla stared out the window at the London streets passing by, her mind racing with implications and possibilities. Had she imagined the significance of what occurred? Was she overreacting to what might have been simply a momentary lapse in attention? Yet, deep in her heart, she knew that something fundamental had shifted during those few moments in the cathedral. The palace buzzed with quiet speculation as staff members processed what they had witnessed. Years of experience had taught them to read between the lines of royal behavior, and the signals from this particular event were impossible to ignore. Conversations were conducted in whispers, but the implications were clear to those who understood the complex web of relationships within the royal household. That evening, as Charles retired to his private quarters, he found himself replaying the events of the day with a sense of satisfaction and warmth he hadn't experienced in months. His interaction with Kate had felt natural and energizing, reminding him of qualities he valued and admired. The contrast with his increasingly strained relationship with Camilla was becoming impossible to ignore. Kate, in her own home with William and their children, reflected on the day's events with a mixture of confusion and concern. She had always maintained appropriate relationships with all members of the royal family, but something about Charles's attention today had felt different, more personal, more intense than the usual family interactions. She made a mental note to be particularly careful about maintaining proper boundaries in future encounters. The first cracks in what had once seemed like an unshakable relationship had become visible to those with eyes to see. The moment when Charles turned away from Camilla toward Kate would be remembered as the beginning of a transformation that would affect not just their marriage, but the entire royal family dynamic. The silence that followed Camilla's rejected gesture had spoken volumes about the shifting loyalties and affections within the House of Windsor. As night fell over London, 3 members of the royal family lay in their respective beds, each processing the events of the day in their own way. Charles felt a renewal of spirit and purpose. Kate experienced a growing awareness of her unique position within the family dynamics, and Camilla faced the devastating realization that the man she had fought so hard to marry might be slipping away from her, drawn to someone who represented everything she could never be. The stage was set for a drama that would unfold over the coming weeks and months, challenging everything the royal family thought they knew about loyalty, love, and the price of duty. The morning that had begun like any other had ended with the foundations of relationships shifted, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. In the days following the Commonwealth service, the atmosphere within the royal household became increasingly charged with unspoken tensions. Charles found himself looking forward to family gatherings with an enthusiasm that puzzled even him. Every scheduled event that might include Kate took on special significance, and he began paying closer attention to his calendar, noting opportunities for interaction with his daughter-in-law. Camilla, meanwhile, had become acutely aware of every glance, every gesture, and every shift in Charles's attention. The woman who had once felt secure in her position as his chosen partner now found herself analyzing every interaction for signs of the growing distance between them. Sleep became elusive as her mind replayed the moment from the cathedral, searching for alternative interpretations that might ease her growing anxiety. The palace staff had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense the changing dynamics within the royal family. Conversations became more guarded, schedules were adjusted with unusual frequency, and longtime employees found themselves navigating increasingly complex emotional territories. The head butler mentioned quietly to the household manager that the atmosphere reminded him of the difficult years during Charles and Diana's marriage breakdown, though the circumstances were entirely different. William remained largely unaware of the undercurrents swirling around his family. His focus was primarily on his own responsibilities and his young family, trusting that the adults in his life would manage their relationships appropriately. Kate had mentioned that Charles seemed particularly attentive lately, but William attributed this to his father's growing comfort with Kate's role in the family and his appreciation for her dedication to royal duties. Charles began finding excuses to spend more time in settings where Kate might be present. Palace meetings were scheduled to coincide with times when she was likely to be visiting. Family dinners were suggested more frequently, and Charles took on a more active role in planning these gatherings than he had in years. His private secretary noted the change, but attributed it to a renewed interest in family unity following some challenging periods in recent royal history. The first major test of these shifting dynamics came during the planning for an upcoming state dinner. The event would host dignitaries from several Commonwealth nations, and the seating arrangements required careful consideration of diplomatic protocol as well as family hierarchy. Charles found himself taking an unusually keen interest in the details, particularly in ensuring that Kate would be positioned where he could engage with her throughout the evening. Camilla watched these preparations with growing unease. Her suggestions for the evening were met with polite acknowledgement, but little enthusiasm from Charles. She noticed that her husband's eyes lit up when discussing Kate's role in the evening, while conversations about their own interactions seemed perfunctory. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore, yet she felt powerless to address it directly without appearing paranoid or jealous. The evening of the state dinner arrived with all the pomp and ceremony befitting such an occasion. Kate looked stunning in a gown that perfectly balanced elegance with appropriateness for her royal role. Her natural grace and genuine interest in the international guests made her an ideal representative of the modern British monarchy. Charles watched her interactions with obvious pride and admiration, his attention rarely straying from her throughout the evening. During the dinner conversation, Charles found himself directing many of his comments toward Kate, seeking her opinions on various topics, and clearly valuing her responses. Their exchanges were intellectually stimulating and marked by genuine mutual respect. The chemistry between them was evident to anyone paying close attention, though it remained within the bounds of appropriate family interaction. Camilla struggled through the evening, maintaining her dignified facade, while internally experiencing what felt like a public humiliation. Seated beside Charles, but increasingly feeling like a spectator to his growing fascination with Kate, she went through the motions of her royal duties while her confidence crumbled with each passing hour. The international guests were charming and engaging, but her heart wasn't truly present for their conversations. The dinner concluded with Charles proposing a toast that included particularly warm words about Kate's contributions to the royal family and her representation of modern British values. His voice carried a warmth and conviction that had been notably absent when he spoke about other family members. Kate graciously acknowledged the recognition, but observers noted that she seemed somewhat uncomfortable with the intensity of Charles's praise. In the days that followed the state dinner, Palace staff began to notice more concrete changes in routine. Charles's schedule increasingly included activities that would bring him into contact with Kate. Morning walks in the palace gardens often coincided with times when she was visiting with the children. Afternoon teas became more frequent, with Kate receiving personal invitations that bypassed the usual formal channels. Kate began to feel the weight of Charles's attention in ways that made her increasingly uncomfortable. While she appreciated his kindness and respected his position, the intensity of his interest seemed to exceed normal family relationships. She found herself being more careful about her appearance when visiting the palace and more guarded in her conversations, sensing that her words were being analyzed and remembered in ways that felt unusual. The relationship between Charles and Camilla continued to deteriorate as the emotional distance between them grew. Their conversations became increasingly strained, with long silences replacing the easy banter they had once shared. Camilla felt as though she was living with a stranger who wore her husband's face but whose heart and mind were clearly elsewhere. Charles seemed oblivious to the pain his behavior was causing Camilla. His mood had improved dramatically since developing his closer connection with Kate, and he interpreted Camilla's increasingly withdrawn behavior as temporary moodiness rather than a response to his own actions. The man who had once been so attuned to her emotional needs now seemed incapable of recognizing the devastation he was causing. The situation reached a breaking point during a private family lunch at Windsor Castle. The gathering was meant to be informal and relaxing, but the undercurrents of tension made the atmosphere anything but comfortable. Charles dominated the conversation, directing most of his attention to Kate and seeking her opinions on everything from current events to family matters. His animated engagement with her contrasted sharply with his polite but distant interactions with Camilla. During a conversation about charitable work, Charles asked Kate about her thoughts on expanding certain royal patronages. His interest in her ideas was evident and genuine, and their discussion became increasingly detailed and passionate. Other family members found themselves essentially excluded from what had become a two-person conversation, with Charles and Kate building on each other's ideas with obvious intellectual and emotional connection. Camilla excused herself from the table, claiming a sudden headache. The excuse was transparent to anyone paying attention, but Charles seemed genuinely surprised by her departure and showed little inclination to follow her or check on her well-being. Instead, he continued his conversation with Kate, seemingly energized by her presence and ideas. Kate, however, had begun to recognize the dynamics at play. The realization that her presence might be contributing to marital tensions between Charles and Camilla filled her with anxiety and guilt. After the lunch concluded, she made a point of seeking out Camilla to express her concern and support, but found her mother-in-law's response cool and distant. The conversation between Kate and Camilla was brief and superficial, but both women understood the subtext perfectly. Camilla was too dignified to voice her suspicions directly, and Kate was too respectful to acknowledge what she was beginning to see clearly. They parted with polite smiles that masked the complex emotions churning beneath the surface. That evening, Charles's euphoric mood contrasted sharply with the growing awareness among other family members that something was seriously amiss. Palace staff whispered about the changes they were observing, while family members began to sense undercurrents of tension they couldn't quite identify. The harmony that had seemed to characterize the royal household was fracturing along lines that weren't immediately obvious to outside observers. Camilla spent the night staring at the ceiling of their bedroom while Charles slept peacefully beside her, his contentment evident even in sleep. She found herself wondering how the man who had once moved mountains to be with her could now seem so oblivious to her pain. The irony of being married to someone who was emotionally absent felt like a cruel joke played by fate. The next morning brought no relief from the mounting tensions. Charles woke with obvious anticipation for the day ahead, knowing that palace business would likely bring opportunities to interact with Kate. His energy and enthusiasm were palpable, but they served only to highlight the contrast with his mechanical interactions with Camilla. As Charles prepared for the day ahead, Camilla made a decision that would change the trajectory of their relationship forever. She could no longer pretend that everything was normal, nor could she continue to suffer in silence while watching her husband's affections drift away from her. The time had come for difficult conversations and painful truths. The stage was set for confrontations that would force all parties to acknowledge the reality of their situation. The careful balance that had maintained the facade of family harmony was beginning to collapse under the weight of unspoken desires and growing resentments. The royal family, so skilled at managing public crises, was about to face a private reckoning that would test their ability to navigate the most complex of human emotions. Charles's innocent appreciation for Kate's qualities had evolved into something that threatened the stability of his marriage and the comfort of his daughter-in-law. What had begun as admiration was becoming something more complex and potentially destructive. The question now was whether the damage could be contained or whether the shifting dynamics would tear apart relationships that had taken years to build. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Camilla made her way to Charles's private study, her heart pounding with the weight of the conversation she knew they needed to have. Sleep had been impossible, her mind racing through years of memories, moments of joy, and the growing realization that the man she had loved for decades was slipping away from her. The time for pretending everything was normal had passed. Charles was already at his desk, reviewing correspondence with an energy she hadn't seen from him in months. His face was animated as he read through various documents, and she noticed he paused longer over anything that mentioned upcoming family events. The sight of his obvious contentment while she suffered in silence only strengthened her resolve to confront the situation directly. She cleared her throat softly, and Charles looked up with a smile that faded slightly when he saw the serious expression on her face. The easy warmth that had once characterized their private moments together was notably absent, replaced by a formal politeness that felt foreign and cold between two people who had shared so much history together. Camilla chose her words carefully, beginning with observations rather than accusations. She mentioned the changes she had noticed in his behavior, his increased interest in family gatherings, and his obvious enthusiasm for events that included Kate. Charles initially responded with dismissive comments about royal duties and family obligations, but Camilla's gentle persistence made it clear she wasn't going to be satisfied with surface explanations. The conversation that followed was painful for both of them. Charles found himself forced to examine feelings he had been avoiding, while Camilla had to voice fears and insecurities she had hoped would remain unspoken. The discussion revealed the depth of the emotional distance that had grown between them, as well as Charles's growing awareness that his feelings about Kate had evolved beyond simple family affection. Charles attempted to justify his behavior by focusing on Kate's positive qualities and her value to the royal family. He spoke passionately about her intelligence, grace, and natural ability to connect with people. But, as he talked, both he and Camilla recognized that his enthusiasm went far beyond professional appreciation. The way his voice softened when he spoke about Kate, the light in his eyes when he described her contributions, told a story that words alone couldn't convey. Camilla listened with growing pain as her husband essentially confessed to feelings that threatened everything they had built together. She had suspected the truth for weeks, but hearing it confirmed in Charles's own words felt like a physical blow. The woman who had weathered public criticism and royal protocol challenges found herself facing the most devastating challenge of all, losing the love of the man for whom she had sacrificed so much. The conversation took an even more painful turn when Charles began comparing Kate's natural warmth with what he described as Camilla's increasing coldness. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the change in their relationship dynamic, apparently unable to see the connection between his own behavior and her emotional withdrawal. The lack of self-awareness was almost as hurtful as the admission of his feelings for Kate. Camilla found herself in the impossible position of trying to explain how Charles's behavior had affected her without seeming jealous or unreasonable. She described the pain of watching him light up in Kate's presence while barely acknowledging her own existence. She spoke about the humiliation of being ignored at public events in favor of his daughter-in-law, and the growing sense that she had become invisible in her own marriage. Charles's response revealed the depth of his emotional confusion. He insisted that his feelings for Kate were pure and appropriate, while simultaneously acknowledging that his marriage to Camilla had lost its spark. He seemed to want permission to continue his emotional involvement with Kate while maintaining the facade of his marriage to Camilla. The conversation revealed a man who wanted to have everything without making difficult choices or accepting responsibility for the consequences. As their discussion continued, it became clear that Charles had been living in a fantasy where his growing obsession with Kate could coexist peacefully with his marriage to Camilla. He had convinced himself that his feelings were harmless because they remained unacted upon, ignoring the emotional devastation he was causing to both women in the process. The conversation forced him to confront the reality that his behavior was neither innocent nor sustainable. Camilla's dignity throughout this conversation was remarkable. Despite the pain of learning that her husband's heart had wandered to another woman, she maintained her composure and spoke with the grace that had characterized her throughout their relationship. However, beneath this dignified exterior, she was making mental preparations for possibilities she had never wanted to consider. The discussion revealed deeper issues in their marriage that had been building for years. The constant public scrutiny, the pressure of royal duties, and the challenge of blending their relationship with family dynamics had taken a toll that neither of them had fully acknowledged. Kate had become a symbol of everything that felt fresh and uncomplicated in Charles's life, while Camilla represented the weight of years and accumulated stress. Charles found himself defending feelings he wasn't entirely sure he understood. His attraction to Kate seemed to encompass not just her personal qualities, but what she represented: youth, possibility, and escape from the complicated history that surrounded his relationship with Camilla. The conversation forced him to recognize that his feelings were more about his own needs and desires than about Kate herself. The most painful moment came when Camilla asked directly whether Charles wanted to end their marriage. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications for their personal lives, the royal family, and the monarchy itself. Charles's inability to answer immediately told Camilla everything she needed to know about the state of their relationship. When Charles finally responded, his words were careful and diplomatic, but they lacked the immediate denial that Camilla had hoped to hear. He spoke about duty, responsibility, and the complexity of their situation, but he didn't speak about love or his desire to fight for their relationship. The absence of passion in his response was more devastating than any direct admission might have been. The conversation concluded with both of them recognizing that their relationship had reached a crossroads. Camilla made it clear that she couldn't continue to live as a spectator to her husband's emotional involvement with another woman. Charles, meanwhile, found himself forced to consider choices he had been avoiding, understanding that his current path was causing unbearable pain to someone he had once loved deeply. As Camilla left the study, both of them understood that their marriage would never be the same. The honest conversation had exposed truths that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. Charles was left alone to contemplate the wreckage of his relationship with Camilla and the impossible complexity of his feelings for Kate. Meanwhile, Kate had begun her day completely unaware of the conversation taking place between Charles and Camilla. Her morning routine with William and the children proceeded normally, but she carried a growing awareness that her presence at palace events had somehow become a source of tension. The previous day's interactions with Camilla had left her feeling unsettled and concerned about family dynamics she didn't fully understand. William noticed that Kate seemed distracted during breakfast, but attributed her mood to the busy schedule of royal engagements ahead of them. He had no idea that his wife had become the unwitting center of a crisis that threatened to tear apart his father's marriage. The innocence of his assumption only highlighted the complexity of the situation developing around them. As news of the conversation between Charles and Camilla began to circulate quietly among palace staff, the household braced itself for changes that seemed inevitable. Veteran employees who had witnessed previous royal crises recognized the signs of an approaching storm. Schedules were reviewed more carefully, security protocols were quietly updated, and contingency plans were discussed in hushed tones. The conversation had changed everything and nothing. Charles and Camilla would continue to fulfill their public duties, maintaining the facade of royal unity for the sake of the monarchy. But, privately, they both knew that their relationship had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The question now was whether damage control was possible or whether the truth would eventually demand more dramatic changes. Charles spent the remainder of the day in a state of emotional turmoil, finally, forced to confront the reality of his situation. His feelings for Kate, his failing marriage to Camilla, and his responsibilities as future king created a web of conflicting loyalties that seemed impossible to resolve. The conversation with Camilla had shattered his ability to live in denial, but it hadn't provided him with any clear path forward. Camilla, meanwhile, began the painful process of considering her options. The woman who had waited decades to become Charles's wife now faced the possibility that their marriage might not survive its first major crisis. The irony of the situation, that another woman had come between them, just as she had once come between Charles and Diana, was not lost on her. The royal family was about to face its most challenging period in years, And at the center of the storm was a relationship that no one had seen coming and that no one knew how to resolve. Kate's growing awareness of the situation began with small details that seemed insignificant at first, but gradually formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Palace staff had begun treating her with a subtle deference that went beyond her normal royal status. Conversations would stop when she entered rooms, and she noticed an increased attention to her comfort and preferences that felt different from the usual royal protocol. The realization hit her fully during a quiet morning at Kensington Palace, when she received an unexpected delivery of flowers with a personal note from Charles. The message was perfectly appropriate, thanking her for her recent contributions to a charity event, but the gesture felt intimate in a way that made her uncomfortable. The flowers were her favorite variety, a detail that required more personal attention than she would have expected from her father-in-law. William had left early for a military engagement, and Kate found herself alone with her thoughts and growing concerns about the dynamics she was beginning to understand. The previous weeks suddenly made more sense as she recalled Charles's increased attention, his obvious pleasure in her company, and the subtle tensions she had sensed during family gatherings. The pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even realized existed were falling into place. Her phone rang with a call from her private secretary, who mentioned that Charles's office had requested her presence at several upcoming events where her attendance wasn't technically required. The requests had been framed as invitations to expand her royal role, but Kate now recognized them as opportunities for Charles to spend time with her. The realization filled her with anxiety about how to navigate this delicate situation. Kate spent the morning walking through Kensington Gardens, trying to process the implications of what she was beginning to understand. Her marriage to William was strong and happy, built on genuine love and mutual respect. The idea that her father-in-law might have developed inappropriate feelings for her felt surreal and deeply troubling. She had always admired Charles's dedication to his duties and his genuine care for others, but this new awareness cast their relationship in a completely different light. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders as she considered the potential consequences of the situation. Her actions and responses could affect not only her own family, but the stability of the monarchy itself. The thought of being responsible for causing pain to Camilla, whom she respected despite their recent awkward interactions, filled her with guilt even though she had done nothing to encourage Charles's attention. That afternoon brought a scheduled visit from Charles to see his grandchildren, an arrangement that had become more frequent in recent weeks. Kate found herself preparing for the visit with unusual anxiety, now understanding the subtext of these family interactions. She was determined to maintain appropriate boundaries while not creating a scene that might upset the children or cause unnecessary drama. Charles arrived with his usual gifts for the children and warm greetings for Kate. But now she could see what she had missed before, the way his eyes lingered on her, the extra warmth in his voice when he spoke to her, and the obvious pleasure he took in her company. The attention that had once seemed like simple family affection now felt charged with emotions that made her deeply uncomfortable. During the visit, Kate made subtle but deliberate choices to maintain distance. She involved the children more actively in conversations, focused her attention on them rather than engaging directly with Charles, and kept their interactions brief and purposeful. Charles seemed confused by the change in her behavior, his attempts to engage her in their usual warm conversations meeting with polite but distant responses. The children, oblivious to the adult tensions around them, enjoyed their grandfather's visit as always. Their innocent joy in his presence served as a reminder to Kate of what was at stake. These family relationships were precious and important, but they had to be protected from the complications that adult emotions could create. When William returned that evening, Kate faced the difficult decision of whether to share her concerns with her husband. The situation involved his father, and any revelation could create family conflicts that might be impossible to resolve. Yet keeping such a significant secret from William felt like a betrayal of the trust and openness that characterized their marriage. Kate chose to begin with subtle questions about William's observations of recent family dynamics. She asked whether he had noticed any changes in his father's behavior or any tensions between Charles and Camilla. William's responses revealed that he had been largely unaware of the undercurrents that had become so obvious to Kate. The conversation with William was delicate and careful. Kate shared her growing concerns without making direct accusations, focusing on her discomfort with the increased attention rather than speculating about Charles's motives. William initially dismissed her concerns, suggesting that his father was simply appreciating her contributions to the royal family and enjoying the company of his grandchildren. However, as Kate described specific incidents and her growing unease with the situation, William began to take her concerns more seriously. His protective instincts toward his wife were strong, and the idea that anyone, even his father, might be making Kate uncomfortable was unacceptable to him. The conversation that had begun with gentle concerns evolved into a serious discussion about family boundaries and appropriate behavior. William's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by concern for both Kate and the potential implications for the family. He had always respected his father and appreciated the positive relationship between Charles and Kate. The possibility that this relationship had developed inappropriate undertones was difficult for him to accept, but Kate's obvious distress convinced him that her concerns were legitimate. Together, they developed a strategy for addressing the situation that would protect Kate while minimizing potential family conflicts. They agreed to document concerning incidents, maintain appropriate boundaries during family interactions, and consider seeking guidance from trusted palace advisors if the situation didn't improve. The conversation brought them closer together while highlighting the complex challenges of life within the royal family. Meanwhile, across London, Charles was experiencing his own awakening as the reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. The conversation with Camilla had forced him to examine feelings he had been avoiding, and Kate's changed behavior during his recent visit had made it clear that his attention was becoming obvious to others. The comfortable fantasy he had been living was collapsing under the weight of reality. Charles found himself alone in his study that evening, contemplating the wreckage of his marriage and the impossible complexity of his feelings. The man who had spent his life preparing to be king was facing a personal crisis that threatened everything he held dear. His growing obsession with Kate had blinded him to the pain he was causing Camilla and the inappropriate nature of his behavior. The realization that Kate had become aware of his feelings and was actively avoiding him was devastating. Her obvious discomfort during their recent interaction had shattered his illusions about the nature of their relationship. What he had interpreted as mutual warmth and connection was revealed to be one-sided attraction that was causing distress to someone he genuinely cared about. Camilla spent the evening in her private rooms, surrounded by photographs and mementos from happier times in their relationship. The conversation with Charles had confirmed her worst fears, but it had also provided a strange sense of relief. The uncertainty and doubt that had plagued her for weeks had been replaced with painful but clear understanding of their situation. For the first time since the crisis began, Camilla allowed herself to consider life beyond her marriage to Charles. The idea of leaving the man she had loved for so long was heartbreaking, but continuing to live as a spectator to his emotional involvement with another woman felt equally impossible. The strength that had sustained her through years of public criticism would now be tested by the most personal challenge of her life. Palace staff continued to observe the changing dynamics with professional discretion and personal concern. The household that had seemed stable and harmonious was clearly experiencing significant stress. Veteran employees began making subtle preparations for potential changes, understanding that royal crises often evolved rapidly and required careful management. The stage was set for difficult decisions that would affect not only the immediate family members involved, but the monarchy itself. Charles's personal crisis was becoming a constitutional concern as questions of duty, responsibility, and appropriate behavior intersected with matters of the heart. The coming days would test the royal family's ability to navigate their most challenging personal crisis in years. As the evening drew to a close, for people lay in their respective beds, each processing the events and revelations of recent weeks in their own way. Charles faced the reality of desires that could not be fulfilled and a marriage that might not survive his emotional infidelity. Kate wrestled with guilt about a situation she hadn't created but felt responsible for nonetheless. William prepared to protect his family while navigating the complex loyalties of being both son and husband. And Camilla began to consider options she had never wanted to contemplate, knowing that some betrayals create wounds that never fully heal. The royal family's private crisis was approaching a point where private solutions might no longer be sufficient. The choices made in the coming days would determine not only the fate of individual relationships, but the future stability of one of the world's oldest monarchies. The awakening that had begun with Charles's innocent appreciation for Kate's qualities had evolved into a situation that threatened to reshape the royal family forever. The crisis reached its inevitable conclusion during what would become known within palace circles as the weekend that changed everything. The royal family had gathered at Balmoral for what was supposed to be a relaxing few days away from the pressures of London and their official duties. Instead, the Scottish castle became the setting for conversations and decisions that would reshape their relationships forever. Charles arrived at Balmoral in a state of emotional turmoil that was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. The weight of recent weeks had taken its toll, and his usual composure was showing cracks that were obvious to anyone who knew him well. The realization that his feelings for Kate were inappropriate and unwelcome had created a crisis of conscience that threatened his ability to function effectively in his royal role. Camilla made the journey separately, a deviation from their usual travel arrangements that didn't go unnoticed by palace staff. The distance between them had become both emotional and physical, and maintaining the facade of marital harmony was becoming increasingly difficult. The woman who had once been Charles's closest confidant now felt like a stranger living in the same house. Kate and William arrived with their children, expecting a peaceful family weekend, but carrying the weight of private concerns about the family dynamics they would encounter. Kate had spent sleepless nights worrying about how to navigate interactions with Charles while protecting her family and maintaining appropriate boundaries. The innocent joy she had once felt at family gatherings had been replaced by anxiety and careful vigilance. The first evening dinner was a study in suppressed tensions and forced normalcy. Charles attempted to maintain his usual role as family patriarch, but his efforts felt strained and artificial. His interactions with Kate were stilted and formal, a dramatic change from the warm familiarity that had characterized their relationship in previous months. The children sensed something was wrong, but couldn't articulate what felt different about their grandfather. Camilla observed the proceedings with the analytical eye of someone who had finally accepted the truth about her situation. She watched Charles struggle with his conflicted emotions, saw Kate's obvious discomfort, and recognized William's growing protectiveness toward his wife. The family dynamics that had once seemed stable and positive were clearly in crisis, and she understood that difficult decisions could no longer be avoided. The breaking point came during a quiet moment after dinner when Charles made one final attempt to bridge the distance that had developed between him and Kate. He approached her as she was reading to the children, intending to join what had once been a natural and comfortable family scene. But Kate's visible tension and the children's confused glances at the awkward adult interactions made it clear that something fundamental had changed. William witnessed this interaction and, finally, understood the full scope of his father's inappropriate behavior. The protective husband and father in him overrode his respect for royal hierarchy as he gently but firmly interrupted the scene, creating a physical barrier between Charles and Kate that was both subtle and unmistakable. The message was clear without being confrontational. Kate was off limits, and any further pursuit would be met with resistance. Charles retreated from the situation with the devastating realization that his behavior had not only destroyed his marriage but had also damaged his relationship with his son and daughter-in-law. The man who had spent his life preparing to lead the royal family was facing the possibility that his personal failures might make him unfit for the role he had always expected to inherit. That night, Camilla made a decision that had been building for weeks. She couldn't continue to live in the shadow of Charles's obsession with another woman, and she couldn't pretend that their marriage could survive the betrayal of his emotional infidelity. The conversation she had been avoiding finally took place in the privacy of their bedroom, and it was both devastating and liberating. The discussion between Charles and Camilla was remarkably civil, considering the circumstances. Years of royal training in managing crises served them well as they navigated the end of their marriage with dignity and mutual respect. Charles finally acknowledged the full extent of his inappropriate behavior and accepted responsibility for the pain he had caused. Camilla, meanwhile, demonstrated the grace that had characterized her throughout their relationship, even as she made it clear that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation was possible. They spent hours discussing practical matters, the impact on the monarchy, the need for discretion in managing their separation, and the importance of protecting other family members from unnecessary scandal. Both understood that their personal crisis had constitutional implications and that their handling of the situation would be scrutinized and analyzed for years to come. The morning brought difficult conversations with other family members. William and Kate were informed privately of the decision Charles and Camilla had reached, and Their relief was obvious despite their attempts to remain diplomatically neutral. William's primary concern was protecting his wife and children from any fallout, while Kate expressed genuine sadness about the breakdown of the marriage despite her own discomfort with recent events. Charles faced the most difficult conversation of all when he acknowledged to William and Kate that his behavior had been inappropriate and that he took full responsibility for the crisis. The apology was sincere and heartfelt, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been done to family relationships. William's respect for his father had been shaken, while Kate struggled with feelings of guilt despite having done nothing to encourage the situation. The children were told simply that grandfather and Camilla had decided to live separately for a while, an explanation that satisfied their immediate curiosity without burdening them with adult complexities they weren't ready to understand. Protecting the next generation from the emotional turmoil of adult relationships became a priority for everyone involved. Palace advisors were quietly briefed on the situation and began developing strategies for managing public perception and media coverage. The separation would eventually become public knowledge, but careful planning could minimize speculation and protect the privacy of all parties involved. The experience gained during previous royal crises proved invaluable in developing approaches that balanced transparency with discretion. Charles began the painful process of rebuilding his life and his relationships in the aftermath of his personal crisis. The realization that his feelings for Kate had been largely fantasy projected onto her because of his own marital dissatisfaction and midlife anxieties was humbling and educational. The process of self-examination was difficult but necessary for his personal growth and his future effectiveness as a leader. Camilla demonstrated remarkable strength and dignity as she prepared for an independent life after years of being defined primarily through her relationship with Charles. The woman who had endured public criticism and protocol challenges found herself facing the ultimate challenge of rebuilding her identity and purpose outside the context of royal marriage. Her resilience became an inspiration to others facing similar life transitions. Kate worked with therapists and advisors to process her own feelings about the situation and to develop strategies for maintaining healthy family relationships going forward. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about the complex pressures of royal life and the importance of maintaining clear boundaries in all relationships. Her marriage to William emerged stronger from the crisis, deepened by their mutual support during difficult times. The family began developing new patterns of interaction that acknowledged the changed circumstances while preserving important relationships. Charles's role as grandfather remained important, but it was now carefully managed to ensure Kate's comfort and appropriate boundaries. Family gatherings were restructured to minimize awkward dynamics while maintaining the children's relationships with all their relatives. Months later, as the dust settled on the crisis, all parties had gained valuable insights about themselves and their relationships. Charles had learned painful lessons about the difference between fantasy and reality, the importance of addressing marital problems directly rather than seeking escape through inappropriate attractions, and the heavy responsibility that comes with his position and influence. Camilla had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, and had built a fulfilling, independent life that allowed her to maintain dignity while pursuing her own interests and relationships. Her handling of the crisis had earned respect even from those who had previously been critical of her role in the royal family. Kate and William had navigated their first major royal family crisis with grace and wisdom, emerging with a stronger marriage and clearer understanding of the challenges and responsibilities that come with their positions. The experience had prepared them for future leadership roles while reinforcing their commitment to protecting their family's privacy and well-being. The royal family had demonstrated that even the most traditional institutions could adapt and evolve when faced with human frailties and changing circumstances. The crisis that had threatened to destroy relationships had ultimately led to greater honesty, clearer boundaries, and more authentic connections between family members. The silence that had once spoken volumes about unmet needs and inappropriate desires had been replaced by honest communication and mutual respect. The lesson learned was that even within the constraints of royal protocol and public expectations, human beings must be allowed to acknowledge their mistakes, seek forgiveness, and work toward healthier relationships. The story that began with a moment of rejected gesture and misplaced attention had evolved into a testament to the possibility of redemption and growth. even in the most challenging circumstances. The royal family had faced one of its most difficult personal crises and had emerged changed but intact, having learned valuable lessons about love, loyalty, and the courage required to choose what is right over what might seem easier or more appealing. In the end, the silence that had once said everything about pain and betrayal had been replaced by words of understanding, forgiveness, and hope for better days ahead. The family that had been fractured by unspoken desires and inappropriate attractions had found ways to heal and move forward, stronger and wiser for having faced their challenges with honesty and grace.